If you can judge a man by his enemies, former Congressman Ron Paul of Texas, the long-retired obstetrician, the 90-year-old three-time member of Congress and three-time presidential candidate, is a very, very good man because he has the best enemies. Here, for example, is an exchange between Jeffrey Epstein and one of his friends. This takes place in early 2012, when there is conversation, as there pretty much always is in the United States for the last 30 years, about when and how we should bomb Iran. And Epstein's friend writes to him this: during an election year, everyone in Congress is falling all over themselves to show support for Israel, except for that dinkus Ron Paul. Ron Paul! Yeah. Jeffrey Epstein and his friends did not like Ron Paul. But what's not to like about Ron Paul? Ron Paul is, and you're going to see him speak in just a moment, probably one of the most manifestly decent men ever to serve in the Congress. Married to the same woman since 1957, beloved by his children, grandchildren, now great-grandchildren. A man who spends his spare time riding his bicycle and tending roses. A person who has articulated the principles of nonviolence throughout his entire public career. A guy who thinks that it is not just unfashionable, but totally immoral to judge people on the basis of their blood. Who thinks racism and anti-Semitism are anti-Christian. A guy who's never said a single thing against a group, ever, not once. In short, a thoroughly decent man of principle. Why does everyone hate Ron Paul? Well, there are a couple reasons. In fact, I personally discovered this way back in 2007 when I covered Ron Paul. He was running for president that year. I'd actually voted for him 19 years before, in 1988, in college for president. I knew nothing about him, but it seemed like an amusing protest vote. He was running as a libertarian then. But fast forward to 2007, he was running in the 2008 presidential campaign, and I thought, this guy looks kind of interesting. I really didn't know much about him, so I went on the road with him for a week, and I wrote a long profile for the New Republic magazine. I was working in television, but I thought it was kind of interesting to write magazine stories again, so I did. And I learned a couple of things about Ron Paul. One, as noted, enormously nice person, gentle temperament, decent, not flashy, not greedy, not dishonest. Two, I learned that Ron Paul is very sincere about monetary policy. Paul would give these stem winders about fiat currency and the gold standard and why the Fed was a scam, and he drew enormous crowds, at least relative to the topic. Now, at the time, again, this was 19 years ago, no one was talking about the gold standard in public and getting anything but laughter and jeers. You were a gold bug. You were insane. You were a moron. Gold wasn't even a topic. If you could check the transcripts from CNBC for the year 2007, gold probably not even mentioned. It seemed crazy to care about monetary policy then. But Ron Paul did, and his audiences responded. That was the first thing I noticed. I had no idea this was a resident issue. I knew nothing about it, so I assumed, since I lived in Washington and was pretty well informed, that no one else knew anything about it either, but I was wrong. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, in the end, millions of Americans were thinking about the stability and the strength of the U.S. dollar. And they were convinced that excessive money printing, since the early 1970s, when the dollar was detached from gold, which is to say from reality, when it became a purely fiat currency redeemable for nothing, they were convinced that the U.S. dollar was weaker than their leaders said it was. And they knew this because the price of goods they bought every week seemed to be going up over time, and no one was mentioning it. Or the goods themselves were becoming smaller. There was shrinkage. This is a well-known phenomenon now. Back in 2007, people weren't talking about it quite as much. If you were 37 in 2007, when you were in first grade in this country, a Snickers bar cost 20 cents. By 2007, it cost nearly $1, and it was smaller. In that and countless other ways, it was obvious that actually this currency wasn't worth what they told us it was, and it was becoming worth less. only Ron Paul was talking about that. And he was making a number of other points too. One was that the United States wasn't actually deriving any benefit from all of these foreign wars, that it just wasn't helping us at all, and that in the end, maybe violence isn't the solution. He wasn't making hostile points. He certainly wasn't attacking anyone. He was merely saying this foreign policy, the foreign policy that led us into, say, the Iraq War, and into Syria, and into Libya, and into Vietnam, for that matter, isn't helping our country. It's incredibly wasteful of money and human lives, and it doesn't bring the result they claim it does. And that's basically all Ron Paul said. He mostly wanted to talk about monetary policy and gold. But for the crime of saying what he said about foreign policy, he was truly hated. And the word went out, time to discredit Ron Paul. Well, I had no idea any of this was going on until I filed my story to the New Republic at the end of 2007. And it was kind of skeptical, but amused and affectionate. I liked Ron Paul. Who wouldn't like Ron Paul? What a nice man. I didn't understand some of what he was saying. I didn't agree with other parts of it, but it wasn't hostile. It was kind of detached and amused and sometimes bemused. So I file it and the editor says, oh, I like the story. Good job. We're done. Then 2 days later, I got a call from that very same editor at the New Republic who said, we have a problem. Ron Paul, it turns out, is a racist and an anti-Semite. And I said, really? I'm not working for Ron Paul. I've got no emotional attachment to the campaign, but he didn't seem like a bigot to me. He seemed like a nice Christian man. Oh, no, the editor said. We sent out a reporter called Jamie Kirchick, a recent Yale graduate and a fervid neoconservative, to go check into Ron Paul's background. And it turns out that he had newsletters back in the 1980s that used racist terms. And we think he's an anti-Semite based on his foreign policy. I said, okay. And so then the author of that piece, Jamie Kirchick, called me and kind of grilled me. You spent time with this man, this bigot? Said Jamie Kirchick? Occupying the moral high ground immediately? I said, I've got nothing to do with that. I didn't hear Ron Paul say anything about it. And they tried to kill my piece, but I pushed hard and it ran at the very end of 2007. Not that anyone cares. It's the New Republic. It has a readership of like 1,900 people, but I cared since I wrote the piece. And then the very next issue, the first issue of 2008, had a cover story by Jamie Kirchick on how you may have reached the wrong conclusion about Ron Paul in the last issue. Actually, the guy's a racist, an anti-Semite, probably. Can't prove it, but of course he is. White Christian guy, right-winger. The piece was actually called Angry White Man, written about the least angry white man this country's ever produced. People have called Ron Paul many things, and some of them may be true. Angry, they've never called him, because he's definitely not angry, as you're about to see. But they went out of their way, and by they, I mean organized neoconservatives, to smear Ron Paul, not simply as wrong on the issues, in fact, not as wrong on the issues. They didn't bother to engage on the issue, philosophically or practically, but wrong as a person, unacceptable. You are not allowed to like Ron Paul because he's bad. He's Nazi adjacent. In fact, his family may be German. That was 2008. By the time Ron Paul, totally undeterred, by the way, ran for president again in 2012, they were foaming at the mouth, not because the Ron Paul movement had become huge or inevitable. He was never in danger of being elected president, but because his decency itself was his calling card. Ron Paul was clearly not a bad person, no matter what they said about him, and his ideas made a kind of inherent sense. There was a coherence to his worldview. And that was a massive threat to the members of our media and commentariat who'd like to use your tax dollars to fight wars on behalf of Israel. That is just a fact. And so the reaction to Ron Paul in that campaign was, how to put it, over the top. For example, here was a young Ben Shapiro live tweeting a Republican debate that year that included Ron Paul. We'll quote selected portions. Quote, Ron Paul is manifestly insane, wrote a young Ben Shapiro, who somehow got into Harvard. You wonder how. As in previous debates, he's now gripping the pen as he would the neck of a Jew. Imagine writing that about somebody. accusing someone of wanting to murder, in fact, strangle to death, quote, a Jew. That's a pretty serious thing to say about a person. In fact, that's slander. And on what basis did a young Ben Shapiro of Harvard, fresh off his deal with Facebook, which he got somehow, on what basis did he make such a claim? Well, on none. Ron Paul never attacked the Jews, has never attacked the Jews. I bet my house Ron Paul has never had an unpleasant thought about the Jews or anyone else. Again, you'll judge for yourself in just a moment. But that played no role in Ben Shapiro's slander. Again, this is December 15th, 2011, Ben Shapiro live tweeting. Gingrich almost drops his pen. Ron Paul grabs it and wrings it like the neck of a Jew. Rick Perry had the memorable moments of the evening other than Ron Paul's corpse leaning toward the grave and strangling the Jews. Again, Ron Paul says sentiment is mixed about Israel and taking action against Iran. Does Ron Paul know a Jew? You could go check the transcript. Probably unlikely Ron Paul used the word Jew. He wasn't talking about Jews. He was talking about the nation state of Israel, the secular country with borders and a military and a government and a very sophisticated lobbying arm of which Ben Shapiro was a part, trying to get the U.S. taxpayer to foot the bill for another one of its wars. It's that simple. And he objected, and everyone else on stage, of course, was for it. Newt Gingrich obediently getting behind Israel, as always. He knows who pays the bills. But Ron Paul, who doesn't really care about money, doesn't believe in fiat money anyway, standing apart, independently saying, I don't think this is a good idea. And Ben Shapiro, among many others, attacking him as an anti-Semite. Whoa. So I guess as you assess this, you see that this isn't the first time this dynamic has been in play in this country. In fact, it's been in play every single time anyone in the professional commentariat dares to question the military alliance between the United States and this foreign country and the wars that the United States is fighting on its behalf. That is somehow an attack on an entire religion or on an entire people. That, of course, is slander. It's untrue. It will inevitably get people killed when you say that. But they say it anyway because it's effective. So they hated Ron Paul. And a big part of the reason is because he opposed their wars. But there's another reason. It wasn't just on foreign policy that Ron Paul made people mad. What really enraged the entire Washington, D.C. commentary class about Ron Paul is that he was right. Not that he was lying, not that he was hateful, not that he was a secret racist or Nazi. All untrue, but they wouldn't care if those things were true. What really made them mad is that Ron Paul precisely, crisply, and honestly diagnosed the problem and predicted the result years in advance. Ron Paul, in political terms, is what we call a prophet. And if there's one thing we know about prophets, is that they usually get stoned to death by angry crowds. In fact, almost always. People hate being told the truth about future events, particularly when they're implicated in the causes of those disasters. They just hate it. Nobody wants to hear about how they're on the wrong path. And so people who call it early are 100% of the time hated for it. They're not rewarded. They're not given some prize. There's no Nobel Prize for predicting the future. There's only a jail sentence or slander from Ben Shapiro and Jeffrey Epstein's friends, the New Republic, and the rest of the liars. And Ron Paul, of all observers of American society, may have gotten it more precisely right than anyone. And if you don't believe it, here's a selection of Ron Paul predictions from 2002. Keep in mind, that was almost 25 years ago, and Ron Paul saw it clearly. Watch.
Mr. Speaker, our government intervention in the economy, the private affairs of citizens, and the internal affairs of foreign countries leads to uncertainty and many unintended consequences. Here are some of the consequences about which we should be concerned. I predict U.S. taxpayers will pay to rebuild Palestine, both the West Bank and the Gaza, as well as Afghanistan. U.S. taxpayers paid to bomb these areas, so we will be expected to rebuild them. Peace of sorts will come to the Middle East, but will be short-lived. There will be big promises of more U.S. money and weapons flowing to Israel and to Arab countries allied with the United States. Federal Reserve policy will continue at an expanding rate with massive credit expansion, which will make the dollar crisis worse. Gold will be seen as an alternative to paper money as it returns to its historic role as money. Military and police powers will grow, satisfying the conservatives. The welfare state, both domestic and international, will expand, satisfying the liberals. Both sides will endorse military adventurism overseas. During the next decade, the American people will become poorer and less free, while they become more dependent on the government for economic security. The war will prove to be divisive, with emotions and hatred growing between the various factions and special interests that drive our policies in the Middle East. Agitation from more class warfare will succeed in dividing us domestically. And believe it or not, I expect lobbyists will thrive more than ever during the dangerous period of chaos. I have no timetable for these predictions, but just in case, keep them around and look at them in 5 to 10 years. Let's hope and pray that I'm wrong on all accounts.
It makes the hair on your arms go up. Imagine having a vision of the future that precise. Would you be able to sleep? Somehow Ron Paul has been able to. He's 90 years old. You'll see in a second. It looks like he's had a good night's sleep in the last 24 hours. But those predictions are so precise that it's spooky. He predicts massive credit expansion before the global financial crisis. This is 6 years before 2008. He predicts the inevitable expansion in both military adventurism and domestic police powers. He predicts that both sides will support this. He predicts that the dollar will become weaker and the gold will rise in compensation. He predicts every major trend of the last 25 years precisely. And so you have to ask, how did he do that? He's not into witchcraft. He's a conventional Protestant Christian. He doesn't have a gypsy telling him the future. No, instead, he relies on principles that he believes in and a very simple moral framework. Ron Paul is often described as a libertarian, but that both over and understates the case. In fact, Ron Paul is fundamentally a moral voice. Ron Paul opposes lying, stealing, cheating, and murder. It's that simple. This isn't complex Joseph Fletcher situational ethics. It's no. Lying, stealing, cheating, and murder are wrong. They're always wrong. They're wrong when you do them. They're wrong when the U.S. government does them. They're wrong when a client state in the Middle East does them. They're always wrong, period. That is Ron Paul's framework for the world. That's his actual ideology. And it turns out if you stick to that, you can see the future pretty precisely.